He was elected in 49. He was the first Latino elected official in the state of California since the 1880s when he was elected. And for many years, he was still the first really prominent.
I went to a community event with my dad, and they were talking about the history of the World War II and the internment of Japanese Americans. And an elder Japanese man stood up, and he says, I was at the meeting, he said, where they were talking about putting us in camps, and a young man by the name of Edward Roybal stood up and said that this will be the shame of this nation.
I had the honor, first, of working for him his last 2 years in Congress. And when I'd pick him up from the airport from his 5 days in Washington, I'd take him home to his home in Pasadena. And during that little drive back to his house, he would tell me stories of the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s. And one of the stories he told me that I'm still fascinated about is that the fact that he never wanted to run for office. It was never in his mind to ever run for office. When he came back for the war, he got involved in helping people with health issues, and that was his passion, health.
When it happened, he went back to, in the 1920s, there had been an influenza epidemic, and two of his young siblings passed away.
Yeah.
So from that point onward, he was very concerned about health, and the health of the community especially. So later he became involved with there was a mobile tuberculosis unit in LA County.
I remember those.
Right.
I remember those.
And he was involved with that, and then...
I still got my little dot on my arm from the shots when we were kids.
Right. And then after the war, he went back to it to kind of get a sense of what he intended to do next.
He really believed in what we call now single payer health care for all people. And he really worked hard and tried to do as much as he could around the issue of health.
Back in the 40s and 50s, that was his passion, getting people immunized, getting them healthy, especially Latinos. And one of the things that he would do is have these amazing big health fairs in East LA and the greater community. And he would have people who would sponsor him, affluent, richer Latinos, business owners in the area. They'd give him some dollars to put on these great events.
And my dad truly believed that health care was a human right, not a privilege. And he wrote one of the first universal health care bills, even before Ted Kennedy, that went nowhere. But did write that. It was the first one to appropriate money for AIDS research. And that's when nobody would touch it back in the 80s, when no one would touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Wow.
And when we went for the dedication for the Center for Disease Control, the CEO of the Center for Disease Control, the president there, said he was in the room when my father appropriated the money for AIDS research, and that he was jeered by some of his peers. And later I said to my dad, I said, Pop, you never told me that story. What did they do? And he says, they blew me kisses and weak wrists and, But my dad had the guts to do it, and he had the sense of justice to do that.
Going back to the beginning, when my father first ran for the city council in the 40s, the first time he ran in 47, he narrowly lost. Then he was elected in 49. And his original campaign committee became the basis of the Community Service Organization, which was the first Chicano, Latino civic political organization in the state. He went on, he also helped found the Chicano Congressional Hispanic Caucus, NALEO, many of the major organizations, both political and civic, nationwide. He was there at the beginning, one of the founders, or if not the founder of each of these organizations.
The story about him running for office is just fascinating. He told me, he says, Alvin, there's a house on Poplar Avenue in El Sereno.
Okay.
I live in El Sereno, born and raised. There's a Poplar connecting Huntington Drive and Alhambra.
Yeah.
That street, we were driving by it. He goes, Alvin, you see that house right there? Lucille, his wife, and I were planning on buying that house. I was saving money up. But what stopped me is people told me I'm going to run for office. And I go, what is that all about? He says, what happened was he was going to have this big health fair. The funders that were funding it came to him and they said, Mr. Roybal, you want this money for your event? You got to run for city council. And he's like, what? So in that sense, he was kind of blackmailed to run for city council.
Yeah.
And he's like, excuse me? He goes, we need you to run. Because up until that point, they were running Latino candidates against the incumbent for city council and losing and losing and losing. And this committee of 10 business owners, they said, well, we need somebody that's clean-cut, honorable, respected, who has a great reputation. And one of the committee members said, Edward Roybal. But he's a healthcare guy. No, we're going to get him to run. He's not into politics. We're going to get him to run. So they all said, when they came up to him, they told him, you're running. So he was telling me that he went into his wife's, his home, and he told his wife, honey, we're not going to buy that house in El Sereno. She's like, why? I'm going to be running for city council. And that was it. That was the story of how he ran. He lost the election, but there was so much passion, excitement for him. They got to see what kind of a man he was. And he basically told me, he goes, at that point, he felt obligated to run for re-election, even though he thought, not re-election, for the next election. And he felt obligated, thinking he wasn't going to win, but he won. And then there goes history.
I think his political career after he got elected to Congress in the 60s is very well documented. But it was really the 40s and the 50s. I mean, in the height of McCarthyism, he opposed the Communist Registration Act.
And to make a long story short, my father was the only one who voted against that in the city council. And a couple of years later, most parts of that were considered unconstitutional. We found the letter, the speech that my dad made. It was all in yellow paper by this time. We found his handwriting where he talked about the fact that he knew it might be political suicide for him to vote against the Communist Registration Act.
He ran for lieutenant governor in 1956. He was drafted from the convention floor, and although it was a Republican year, the Republicans won everything, he led the Democratic ticket. He came out ahead of the rest of the Democratic field in the statewide elections then, ran for supervisor and narrowly lost in a very contested election, and then ended up in Congress for 30 years.
We were harassed by the LAPD for years, just for years. The word was out that they told us that if my father left the house alone, he would get framed for a crime. So there were many years that my father always had someone. There were threats on our life as kids, threats on my dad's life constantly.
We used to get followed by police. Even me as a little elementary school kid, we'd be followed to school, we'd be followed home, and there were threats. And I being the only boy and the youngest, there were threats to kidnap me. So one of the earliest things I remember as a young child is being told that if I was ever stopped by a cop, I was to start running and run all the way home and not stop till I got home. So I grew up in that kind of atmosphere. I remember police cruising by our house and shining spotlights in our window and things like that.
This is something that I'll never forget. And I'll never forget it because this was the evening that I asked my wife to marry me.
Edward Roybal, one of the first Mexican Americans elected to Congress, experienced discrimination firsthand.
And the policemen lined us all up, about 14 couples, made us put our hands up over our heads, and they went through our pockets. Then they asked each one of us to show credentials. I gave them my wallet, and after they looked at it, this policeman started to take my cards out of my wallet and drop them to the sidewalk. And then after he did that, he said, now you pick them up.
My dad used to say to us, you can't become the thing you're fighting. And this was before we ever heard of Gandhi.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
You can't become the thing you're fighting. There was going to be a vote to raise the pay of policemen. And I remember some community members saying, and I was going to say it in Spanish, but I won't say it. No seas tonto, I'm going to say tonto. Don't be dumb, Roybal. You know what the word is, though. This is a time to show them, you're a councilman, you have power now. Show them, you vote against that raise. And I'll never forget this. I was a little kid. I was sitting under the dining room table playing with dolls, listening to this. And my father said, when you respect people, when you pay them well, when you give them health care, when you are decent, the quality of the profession will rise. And my father voted for a pay raise for police.
My father was rushing to get to the city council to vote in favor of a pay raise for police officers. He got stopped by the police and they held him and everything else, and then he finally went on and he cast that vote in their favor.
Isn't that
He was an amazing man. He was an amazing man.
Can you say some last words? Anything you'd like to say about your dad? And I'm just amazed
Yeah.
right now. Just hearing just in a couple minutes all this about your dad.
Yeah, few people know that my dad played the guitar and sang.
Well, okay.
And when he was a young man, he and his uncles would play at the Orpheum. You know, they used to show a movie and then they would have vaudeville. He and his uncles would play. And my dad wrote a song called Dueña de mi Corazón. And he wrote it for my mother. And my dad...
He's just an all-around good guy. I mean,
he was a very loving man. He used to sing to us at night, you know, me importas tú, y tú, y tú. And he was a head stroker, and he always said, I love you. Every night he would come in and stroke our head and say he loves us, you know. Despite how busy he was and all of that.
Right.
Yeah, he was a good man. When we were children, people would come to our door with personal problems. And I remember at least 2 occasions where an elder woman came and her husband had died and she didn't have enough money to bury her husband. And so my father paid for the burial. At least 2 that I know of. After my father passed, my dad's assistant, said to me that when my father would fly in from D.C., he would pick up my dad at the airport. And then they would go to a grocery store and he would buy a ton of groceries and then take it to a man who he knew as a child who lived in Skid Row. And every month my father would I never knew that. I never knew my dad did that. And I learned that after my dad passed, that my dad did that. My sister and I went to a florist shop to buy some flowers for her yard, right? And we go there and the man said, when my sister gave him the card and it said Roybal, he said, are you related to Edward Roybal? And we said, yes. And he says, he used to come by all the time and say hello to us. And he said, when my dad died, he said, my dad was still a councilman. He said, when my dad died, your father went to my dad's funeral. My dad really worked his community.
And many people don't know him. He's a quiet guy. He's not an overpowering. It's not about him. It's about others, and that's why he's a secret giant. He's a silent giant that I think people just don't get it. And when they really hear his story, I think people are amazed.
That's phenomenal.